Hi everyone, Matt here, introducing the latest Commonplace podcast. In this episode, we speak to a friend and colleague, Claire Yorke, all about empathy. What do we mean by empathy? Why is it so important for creating strong, resilient, creative societies? Are we seeing empathy edged out of society? And if so, how do we bring it back? Hope you enjoy. And as ever, if you want to leave a comment or send us an email and continue the conversation that we start here today with Claire, please do. They're always welcome. Okay, enjoy.
I'm Dr Claire Yorke, and I'm a senior lecturer at Deakin University in Australia. And I'm actually based at Canberra, where I teach at the Australian War College. And I'm also an author. I recently published a book, Empathy in Politics and Leadership, with Yale University Press. And I've been working on empathy and emotions now for the last 15 years or so. I did my PhD on empathy and diplomacy, and it's been a theme that's animated me really since about 2013.
Beautiful. Thank you, Claire. Well, let's start with that word empathy, and because I think people will have their own individual ideas about what empathy means, and also there's kind of social narratives around the meaning. So tell us what it means to you and why it's important.
So for me, empathy is an attempt to understand the perspectives, experience, emotions, interests, and social, political, economic context of others, to try and understand their history, how they create meaning, how they view the world. And it is variable. I think there's different forms of empathy that we can talk about: interpersonal empathy, strategic empathy, collective empathy. But really, it's about trying to understand someone else's world through their eyes and perspective. And a key part of that is about understanding the role that we play in shaping and influencing and engaging with them. So being self-reflective, being aware of how we have an impact on the world. And I think it's important for multiple reasons. At a personal level, I think it's because we're fundamentally wired to connect with people. I think we have this intrinsic need to belong, and I think we're richer and stronger when we can connect with people and find commonality. I think also we live in societies right now that are quite divided, quite polarized. There's tensions. We're seeing that there's a lot of different opinions and perspectives on the world, and empathy is a vital tool to try and understand how people are interpreting what's going on, what matters to them, what are their concerns, and where is there maybe a common cause. And often once you look behind the lens, below the surface, you start to see that actually we do have more in common, and maybe the outcome is the same. We want, families to be safe. We want to feel we've got good healthcare. We want to feel like we've got opportunity, but the way of getting there maybe is different, or our approach is from a very different angle. So it's vital for that. And as a result, I think it helps to create more vibrant, healthy democracies, because democracies are fundamentally about diversity and plurality and living alongside and coexisting with others, and about creating that resilience within society. I think a homogenous society is not very resilient often. We need to find ways to live together better. I can go on. I have a lot.
Well, we'll invite you to, for sure.
Yeah.
No, I definitely want to return to some of those themes, particularly around I suppose you mentioned division and the culture and contexts that might be leading to that, and how we bring empathy back into play, or more empathy. But before then, one question I wanted to ask you is, in the work and research that you've done, have you noticed that empathy is either expressed or understood or experienced differently according to different cultures, contexts, maybe identities at all?
Yes, I think we don't have one unified definition of empathy. And what I find, I work a lot with military professionals and foreign policy practitioners, and sometimes empathy is seen more as something more akin to compassion or sympathy. And actually, it's really important to make that distinction. They're not the same. Compassion, as you very well know, both of you, is far more about that pro-social imperative to help alleviate someone and help them when they're suffering or they're vulnerable. And sympathy as well contains within it those elements of maybe pity or support for somebody else in an emotional way, whereas empathy can be an element of connecting and feeling for the suffering of others, but it can also be more pragmatic. And so trying to convey its different dimensions to different people is important. I think some cultures see it more instinctively as part of how they operate than others. Certain countries where maybe emotions are seen as a weakness, ideas of empathy may not be seen in the same way. But I also think there's a danger in making generalities about how different people see it, because I think a lot of people are, as I said, intrinsically wired to connect with people. So yeah, we do have different interpretations. There's been a prevailing dialogue, especially in the past few years, about empathy being a weakness. We're seeing it, especially in America, this idea that it's the greatest civilizational weakness of the West. And there's a lot of especially evangelical Christians who view it as a weakness, which I think is an interesting angle. So there's that kind of different interpretations of what it means and its implications.
Again, themes that I think we're going to want to pick up. The last question I'll ask at this point, though, is around what you're kind of getting to here, which is around new trends in the way that we're thinking about empathy, and also something you mentioned before around division. This feels like such a common narrative that we are more divided, we're more isolated, and therefore some may speculate we're also less practiced at and less able to experience empathy for others. What do you think about that assertion? Is there any evidence that this is the case? And if there is, I'm interested in why it might be happening.
Yeah, there has been a lot recently published, especially on ideas of loneliness and this loneliness epidemic. We're more connected, but we're more apart at the same time. And I do think there is a trend that maybe we are not engaging in person in civic spaces and community as much as we should and we used to in the past. And I think that's worrying. I do think there's also different ways of connecting in virtual spaces. People are finding communities there. They're reaching beyond the boundaries of maybe their traditional circles of concern. And we're able to care for people, and feel for people and understand experiences that are so far from our own in ways that we wouldn't have. So there's these kind of competing tensions at the same time. What I have found with the research is actually there's this huge appetite for people to return to grassroots connection and community, and to try and return to some of those very human instincts to work with people more, to get involved, to participate, to support one another. And so I derive a lot of hope from that. And I think the challenges in our media environment, the story about division and polarization and loneliness is far more compelling. And actually, when you start scratching below the surface, as I suspect both of you do with your work, Eddie, I know what you're doing in America right now is very much in that field. People are hungry for that. There's a real appetite. And I think there's a space to create better stories around that connection and the kind of strength that brings, even if it's less observed.
Absolutely amazing. There's some, like Matt, I'm like, there's so much to pull on here. So I'll take up, I think, this theme around story, because I think it's I love the fact that it's become such a public conversation for us to talk about story and the role that it plays in everything. And I'm curious specifically in your experience around, I guess it's going to be a two-part. We'll start with the first. The first part of this is, in your experience, what role does worldview play on kind of like the stories that inform this idea of empathy, or what it even means to empathize with someone else? I'm curious. Yeah, well, I'll stop there.
And by worldview, do you mean kind of how much experience people have in the world, or about things like religion or culture?
Right. Great qualifier. And I'll say that for me, I am thinking broadly, right? Because I think worldview can be the sum of, I grew up in this area, in this country, in this language, in this culture, and that is my worldview, versus I grew up in this home, had these experiences, I work in this profession, or or I have this kind of level of status, and all of that becomes a worldview. But the things that kind of shape where we kind of land, and then what we're, um, there's a part of me that's thinking like, this is when people are trying to empathize with us, this will be them getting into our world, but then we have to leave that to get into someone else's.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple elements, and I think it varies a lot according to people. I think some people naturally have a more innate capacity for empathy. That is just how they're wired, and they're more predisposed to that kind of sensitivity to others. I think if you live in a very rarefied or privileged environment, or very kind of isolated environment, I think it becomes harder than if you live in a very diverse environment where you start to see that sense of community. And I think particularly of London. I don't know if Matt's had this experience. I'm not from London, but I lived there for 12 years. And I think what's so striking about London is you revel in the diversity of the city, the kind of exposure you get to cultures, different foods, different music, different people, different experiences, different stories. And I think it kind of, coming from a relatively small region in the north, you feel yourself kind of crack open a little bit and just become much more aware of the life that is beyond what you knew, and more curious. And your curiosity is kind of fed at every step, and you are welcomed through that. So I think there's something in that your worldview does shape it. And but I also think that's something we can bring into education. I think you can live in a small town and have a worldly education. And so it's that kind of tension. I think as well, I do think there's an element of security in worldview. I think if you are insecure in your sense of identity and your sense of belonging, I think maybe empathy is harder. And that's a bit of a hypothesis. I haven't tested that. I think there's data that shows that is accurate, but I do think if you feel more like you belong somewhere, it's easier to tolerate difference.
Absolutely. It's funny because you started to go into the next part of the question for me, because I think there's a part of me that says, in my own empathy journey, I understand why people might be a little intimidated by it or threatened by what comes up, because it's not always easy to come, like when you empathize with others, there is the risk of your worldview changing or your sense of reality shifting in a way that you weren't anticipating or even looking for. And navigating those feelings can be really difficult because there's not always a guidebook of how to process being, disillusioned about reality. And I'm curious to know, in your experience of like when people are experiencing empathetic change, or the impacts of engaging empathy, kind of are there specific things that really help kind of people navigate that versus things that kind of make it more challenging to navigate in terms of practice or environment or what have you?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And this is why I push back against people who say that empathy is a weakness, because I think it takes a huge amount of courage and strength to sit with that kind of difference, to sit with experience that may be polar opposite to your own, to sit as well sometimes at the more extreme ends with opinions and perspectives and ways of living that are deeply offensive to your own identity and your way of being, and to the views and the values that you hold. And so that's very uncomfortable work. And I think it does require you to kind of suspend your ego a little bit. It requires you to practice patience and tolerance and suspend judgment. Even if when I talk about this, I say you can still have red lines. You should still have red lines and boundaries on your empathy. But I think part of it, I talk about empathy as being connected to emotional intelligence, because I think it's when we are more emotionally literate. And there's people like Susan David in America who's written about emotional agility. When you're more able to regulate and understand your emotions and interpret what's going on, it makes it easier to go, I am deeply uncomfortable with this right now, but I don't have to act on that discomfort. Let me just observe it and let me move on. There's some really interesting work done as well by someone called Mark Brackett at Yale University, and he does a lot on kind of emotional intelligence in schools. And he's got the ruler method, which is about how you kind of regulate and understand your emotions. And so I think a way of approaching it is through developing that capacity. And it is about developing a capacity for diverse emotions and to know your role in it. And that's again why I talk about empathy as being about self-reflection, because there is an interaction. Empathy is about relationality. It is not unidirectional. So yeah. And there's easy ways in, you know, like the more we get into film and music and food, and you start to just go, oh, actually, this is quite good. Let me learn a bit more. You know, there's ways to ease yourself in gently without having to go right into the real confrontation.
Exactly. And last thing I'll say here before Matt, you jump back in, but I think that there's my experience in the US of hearing people talk about empathy, I think is connected to the ways that, like, we talk about the ability to navigate your emotions, but also Matt and I were just before you were talking about how some of our social identities can get in the way of, I mean, identity can play a really big part in where we feel safe. And sometimes our identities are only held together by the story that we have about about others and about, you know, what have you. And in the US, we're seeing that, right? You know, it's hard to live a story where you aren't, like, for instance, what if our country isn't the greatest? What if that's not how you measure the well-being of the people is to have a moniker that you just kind of promote? And what does it mean to then figure out who we are in the world and what our role is in the world that isn't about domination or this other comparative sense of self? And so I think what you're talking about is just, I feel the hunger and the thirst myself. And I think that identity plays such a big part in it.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important conversation for America to be having right now. And it's a hard one because you have to confront legacies of various forms of harms and violence and structural inequalities and a lot of things that aren't working in a way that you need real leadership to guide you through. And you need people to invest in a new story.
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
Well, can I actually pick up on that, Claire, about the inequality thing? Because one thing that I've like struggled with in the work that we do, and I mean work we as in like social change work in general, is I want to phrase this correctly because I think it could sound didactic to be saying we need empathy or this person needs to feel empathy, but we are asking or inviting in more empathy, but there is a structural barrier potentially or a difficulty in asking that of people who are historically marginalized, prejudiced against, lacking in resource. How do we think about empathy in those within that structure?
Yeah, and that is one of the challenges. I touch on it briefly in the book, and it's something that could be unpacked in a whole other book, because I think the challenge is that you're asking people who have not only had to deal with that marginalization and those harms to then develop the capacity to understand people who have done that. And I think it's about not expecting it overnight and not actually, I think it's about creating community around those people so that other people can help process that and understanding that not everyone is going to want to go through that. Some are not going to want to go through it immediately. They might know that there is a need for a certain element of healing, but that is going to take time. But I do think that's why we have to talk about empathy, not as this kind of panacea and as something that's hard work, because it makes demands on people and they aren't always just, actually, especially in those situations. And I think being very open about the costs to people. There's an academic, Naomi Head, who writes about the costs of empathy as being, to do with embodied felt costs and identity costs, and the cost to your narrative, to your sense of belonging. And I think we need to be open when we're asking people to engage in empathy, to understand someone who has caused harm, to be open about what that is costing, and to not expect it to be a quick solution or process. And by being aware of that process and the kind of the ups and downs that it involves, it means that we can be a bit more forgiving when our empathy fails.
Is it? Sorry, Claire, you carry on.
No, I think a key part of that is creating communities around these people who maybe are more neutral, who are able to hold the space and provide that kind of safety when it's needed, and space and distance when it's needed, but still hold the kind of like connection. So there's a role for people who are maybe not of either group, if that makes sense, but to be respectful and to approach it in a way where those people who are holding space are listening and understanding their positionality within that process at the same time.
Is there something in that then about, as well, like you said at the outset, that we can conceive of different kinds of empathy, like collective empathy, perhaps empathy for yourself as well, and understanding how you've experienced this and the story that you've been through. And I mean, empathy for a system sounds very strange, but I'm thinking like at least an understanding of the system that's created the people that are producing these actions. Does that help us as well to not put all the onus on you need to feel empathy, or it would be helpful to feel empathy for this individual person who's done this to you, but there's actually a more complex story, or a potentially more helpful ask or invitation?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of framing it. I think that idea of understanding the structural context that people come from and the assumptions and kind of inbuilt perspectives and biases that come with that is a helpful way of doing it. And I think it has to be matched though with the next step of that is then, so what do we do about that? Because it has to go beyond just that understanding. Like if we can recognize that a system has produced inequality, inequity, injustice, then what do we do? And how do you then involve everybody in that process? That it's not just tear it all down and rebuild it with something that's going to replicate the problems, but the other side. How do you all come together in that kind of more common place to rebuild?
Well, building from that, I mean, this is potentially a two-part question, because I know that you do work with leaders, and in particular leaders in the military, right? So I've got one question to start us off, which isn't quite so related, but I'm interested just for you personally, are there things that have surprised you about working with people in those positions, a position which we would perhaps stereotype and automatically go, they're not going to get empathy, they don't understand empathy? And I sort of do know that you found that actually sometimes the opposite is true.
I found people who are involved in frontline work, whether military or diplomacy or foreign policy development, normally are very eager and keen to learn and are quite robust in being confronted with things that are difficult and challenging. That doesn't mean they agree immediately. It doesn't mean there's not a journey and a process, but I feel like I find it very rewarding, and people are very open to learning from one another because they also want to improve. They're in environments where you want to be very good at what you do. And especially dealing with leaders in these environments, so that idea of self-improvement, how can I learn to lead better? I think they do that quite naturally. And I think it's also interesting to consider some of the tensions that you deal with in the military and in diplomacy, where you're dealing with difficult actors that they have to deal with. So often they have that experience of both the process of trying to understand, but being aware as well of maybe the moral injury that accompanies that understanding. And I think that's really interesting for me.
And is that a case where they're understanding empathy as a tool to do their work, but not necessarily always as empathy as a condition that they want to build more of into society? And are there dangers with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies depending on different people. I think, you know, we're dealing with very different workplaces, not just in the military and defense, but across all organizations, where how do we create better workplaces where people can thrive? So at leadership level, I think there's a natural understanding that this is actually a really valuable toolkit and skill to be able to get the best from the people that I work with. There is an element that it's a tool to get things done in how you do it, to build the relation so that things are smooth, to build the relation so that you kind of understand what's needed from a situation. And I think, I mean, I write about this in another article about kind of its role in strategy, is I actually think eventually you get to a point where you realize that the way to do long-term strategy is that you have to try and make it empathetic and look at the ways in which you bring different people together to create something sustainable, because the strategic idea of domination and zero-sum power is actually, in my view, not very strategic, because even if it gives you short-term dominance and a short-term win, you can't sustain that. You will always, as history has proven, have people who want to push against that misuse and abuse of power. So how do we then think differently about strategy in a way where you go, well, who has an investment in this? Who has a stake in this? How do we get them around the table, engage them early on, not just come with solutions? And I find it fascinating living in Australia is you look at how countries like Australia and the UK and America engage with countries like in the Pacific Islands. And, you know, these countries will say, you come to us when you need something, but we actually want you to come to us early on and to listen and to understand what we need. And I think then that once you're exposed to that, when you're in a frontline role and you're going, oh, we can't dictate terms, that then changes the way you think about how you do business.
I think as well, that goes back to something that you said earlier around, it doesn't always have to be heavy, about learning about people as people and their whole world. This is I think in that way, it's kind of a strategic shift in the way that we are relating to people and working and thinking about society, when we're focusing on that, not just in this specific instance, I'm practicing empathy because I need to know about this part of you. It can go so much wider if we let it. Final question I've got for this bit, and then I'll hand back to Eddie, is my second part of that question, which is that I know in your book, and we've talked about this as well, you focus both on leaders but also on communities. And I wondered if you see any tensions potentially in whether those two things can work side by side. You know, developing empathy from the grassroots perhaps has one set of dynamics. Empathy from leaders perhaps assumes a certain way of society or certain structures and dynamics. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, so many great questions. Yes, I talk in the book, and it's the way the book evolved really about the need for empathy to exist in an ecosystem. Because I started out writing a book and it was just going to be a book about leadership. It was started in 2020 when we were just in the kind of peak of the early days of the pandemic. And we were hearing a lot of the value of empathy from various world leaders. So it was just meant to, at the start, be a book about empathy and leadership. And then as time went on and I was writing, we found that leaders like Jacinda Ardern kind of encountered challenges, and people's appetite for empathy shifted. And I was in America at the time. I was living in New Haven. And I found that in the early days, people are like observing all the masks, they're keeping distance on sidewalks, they're isolating. And then after a while, people are like, no, I'm not going to do this. And so you see that kind of exhaustion of empathy. And I started to think, you know what, you can have the most empathetic leaders, but if we don't have systems and structures and almost social and cultural norms around it, they will never be able to succeed. And so we have to then think about, how do we exist in this ecosystem? And so I argue in the book, I think it's one of my favorite chapters, is the chapter on community, because it's very hopeful. You see a lot of communities where actually empathy is already very rich, and it's very much built into how people do business. Community centers, civic spaces, initiatives to help the vulnerable, to inspire people in education, all of this. Like, that's very much built around empathy. And my argument is that the more we start to practice this at a citizen level, at a community level, the more we start to set the expectations of how we want people to engage and how we want people to govern and how we want them to participate and work with us. And I think this is connected to a belief I have that we need more participatory democracy. We need more leaders to come into communities and to listen and to learn. But we also need communities to go, what is involved in the front end of politics? Like, it's messy and it's hard. And I think sometimes we can disparage and write off politicians who are having to make impossible trade-offs between finite resources and difficult decisions. And we need to also be better at understanding what are we asking them to do, what are the constraints they face, and how do we therefore learn more about that so we can also be more empathetic about the demands on them. And I think the more we build that two-way dialogue, they will take different forms, as you said, in leadership and community, but hopefully you'll generate more of an understanding of how they need to meet in the middle and how they need to coexist and work together.
Oh my God, I'm loving this conversation so much. I'm just putting that out there. Okay, it's funny too because I think I want to I pick up there for a number of reasons. One, tying a couple things together. A lot of times that kind of community work is slow and it's at a pace that doesn't necessarily match the pace of the appetite that we have for solutions specifically. Like, that is a thing that I think is a constant challenge. We want the solution before the process of finding and generating that solution.
Yeah.
Which in part, and I say that because there's a part of me that says another thing about engaging people in empathy and then turning that into action or turning that into compassion and other things is that sometimes I think it requires imagination.
Yeah.
Because it's not a reality that people are actually accustomed to, and that we don't necessarily have an idea of a social system that's going to uphold and sustain our empathetic commitments. And so we're trying to figure out, how do you get people to envision this possibility that they may not have a lot of reference for or any experience. And I'm curious to know, and that's my experience, of course, but I'm curious in your work, what role have you found imagination and creativity to play in engaging people in empathy work in general?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's vital. And I think that's why, there's a lot of debates right now about education and degrees in the arts and humanities. Like, we need the arts, we need creativity, we need to maintain that very human capacity for imagination that no technology can ever replicate or should replicate. It was interesting. So I actually spoke to someone, Michele Elena, who is based in Bologna, and he was the head of the Civic Imagination Office, which is very much about imagining difference, and bringing that creativity in. And then I spoke to in Denmark, there's this organization, and my Danish, I'm going to massacre my Danish, I'm very sorry, Sea de Zamler, which is kind of this citizens organization, community hub led by someone called Paul Natorp. And that's very much about saying to people, bring your ideas. What do you want to see? Bring them to us. Let us help you create this. So you'd get people coming and saying, well, what if we empathized with the wildlife of the city? And we took it in turns, like, imagine that we were pigeons. What would that mean for how we treat buildings and for the spaces we provide, and for birds of prey or for bugs? And it's interesting, I saw a story the other week about in the UK, there was a town that did this and got people to imagine that they were animals to understand the wildlife and the kind of implications of wildlife and environmental change on the wildlife. And I think, there's an organization in the UK called Empathy Week, Empathy Studios Empathy Week, and they take films into schools and they say to children of various different ages, can you connect with this? What do you imagine you can do? And I think that creativity is absolutely key to then doing the next steps when you meet someone different, having that curiosity, finding those common connections. And I think there's scope to improve that, to build that muscle a bit more, because I think we've slightly lacked that. And a key prerequisite to that kind of imagination is also the ability to have hard conversations and confront what's not working. You know, how do you imagine it differently? And I think there's that tension, but it's a creative tension that has to exist.
Oh my God, yes. I mean, I think that there's something, it's interesting. So my next phase of this, and this is a first, I think, but it's, we talk about a lot of different things, like Matt and I, and all of our conversations have led to different ideas that feel like they have a place in terms of empathy work. And it is in a bit of that overlap of empathy, compassion that gets people tricky. But I wanted to bring up some of those things and see kind of what your kind of response to some of these ideas, if that sounds okay. And so I'll start with one that is relative to this notion in some classes that have happened. There's been a talk about, I'll make the statement. The statement that I'll make in sessions is, the quality of society is really based on what we envision and tolerate for strangers.
Oh,
you know, like the quality of the society is based on that, because there's something about our ability to separate from the stranger's experience that is connected to this feeling of empathy that I think is there, but also there's the reality churn that we put with this is, but everyone that you love and care about is a stranger. To the majority of the world, like to the people that they pass on a regular basis. And so whatever it is that you're hoping for the person that you love most is something to hope for strangers, because it seeing to that, holding that makes it more possible and more likely for the people that you love to experience that, if more of us hold it. That's the thought. I'm curious to know how that lands in your empathy work, and also in that framework of thinking about empathy and how that might be helpful, or potential pitfalls of that kind of notion being out there or put out there.
Oh, I really love that. Yeah, I that resonates strongly, because I mean, I've moved several times in the last few years. I've been a stranger in multiple countries, and you judge it by how you are welcomed and how you feel, and there's a huge sense of isolation and loneliness that comes in those first few weeks and months in a new place, and anyone who's moved will know that, and so the idea of like welcoming, I think, is key. I have a similar kind of quote, but I like yours much more, which is, you judge a society by how they treat the weakest and the ones that are most vulnerable, in the most vulnerable positions. You know, it's not how you treat those at the top, it's how are you looking after those who are most in need. But I think that idea of strangers is much more encompassing. I think that's really lovely.
Oh, look, I'm glad. That makes me excited. Okay.
Yeah, you should have that as a quote somewhere. That's a good one.
Okay, perfect. Okay, this will be my last one, and then of course I'll go ahead and back to Matt. This is how do I spin this yarn? But there's the conversation that is about understanding bias, I guess, in a way, or bias, or even like folks who do things that might be harmful to other folks. And I've made the statement of like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to piece it together. But I guess I'll pull from Toni Morrison, who once was in an interview where she said, you know, and I'm going to paraphrase because I want it to be broader, but she was essentially saying folks who have a lot of privilege and power must think about, like, take the time to really think about, what does it mean to need other people to be on their knees in order to feel tall? And I've had the thought for myself that says, for me, of all the choices that you could make about what to spend your time doing, your energy, your talent, the gift of life doing, to dedicate part of that time to interfering in someone else's life, not to their benefit, not for their good, is a reflection of a kind of pain that you must carry. Like that must be something internal, because you could choose anything. Even if you just like ice cream, you could just go do that, or a book or a landscape or whatever, you could do that. And when people are in a position where they decidedly position themselves in someone else's life that's a reflection of a pain.
Yeah.
That really it is beneficial to even the like, and I say this really qualify, in marginalized communities, I think it helps to understand that motivation isn't about you, that it isn't actually about your person or even the identities or the politics. It's about something that is stirring in a person that makes them feel that they must interfere in your life, that they must play a role in creating that danger, and that it helps, I think, us find ways to figure out how do we navigate that conversation and how do we have an appropriate response to it. Again, I know that was a lot, but that's another thing I'm dropping. I'm curious to know, how does that land in terms of thinking about that from your work and your research on empathy?
I think what's so interesting listening to that is the generosity that your interpretation extends to others. And I think that kind of generosity of spirit is a really useful starting point for empathy, you know. And I do agree, you know, I don't understand why people interfere and actively make life harder for others. It is so easy to lift someone up. But also, you know, so many of us do it when we just turn a blind eye to suffering and we walk by, you know, and it's not just that proactive, it's passivity is also, there's something in that. What does it hurt us? Does it hurt us that we recognize that our society isn't functioning as we thought? Does it hurt us because maybe we know that that could be someone we love, or, you know, we don't want to imagine what people go through, that failure of empathy. So I do think there's something in that. And I think it's gives, the way you framed it offers a space to understand that privilege from a different perspective, right? To open up a conversation around, why is it you do this? What do you benefit from this behavior? How is it that you could transform that in a way that is kinder to yourself, but also much kinder to other people? I think that's what I like about the generosity of it that you gave. And I think as well that empathy works two ways. And sometimes we do have to understand, like, where is this coming from? Because if you want to overturn it, you want to change it, you still have to know where it's coming from, even if you dislike it and it's harmful. So yeah, I love both those ideas that you gave. I think they resonate very strongly with me.
Very glad.
Well, in sort of coming towards a close, Claire, I've been playing with this question slightly the best way I wanted to ask it. I still haven't worked it out, but here goes. So we've been talking quite a bit about, I suppose, obviously, an assumed, I think, desire to cultivate more empathy in the world. And I'm sure that there'll be people who have been watching thinking, how do we go and do that? I don't necessarily want to ask, though, like that level of question, but I think what I do want to ask is, what do you do, Claire, if you feel that you're struggling to experience empathy, or if you're feeling that, and not necessarily with a specific person, but it can be that, but if you feel like you're going through a time when you're lacking empathy either for yourself, or you'd want more empathy for others, or you feel it would be helpful, what do you find useful for yourself?
Oh, that is such, that's actually, it's a much more personal question, but it's a really good one. I definitely have empathy blocks, and as much as I study this, I do think partly studying it is a way of understanding them, you know, for myself. Like, why does this matter to me? How do I get better at it? Because I don't practice it perfectly at all. For me, I find it's helpful to acknowledge when I'm confronting a block. And I think that works when you're dealing with someone, like, look, I'm struggling to understand right now. And acknowledging which boundary has been crossed by this, or what it is confronting in you. And I think if you're able to articulate that, I think maybe people can find a way to connect with that, or to kind of lean in a little bit to understand a bit more. For example, like I struggle a lot with some of the politics in America right now. I mean, not just America, you know, every country has a problem with politics, but there's some things that I really struggle with. And it just helps to kind of articulate, this is what I find problematic. This is the aspiration I would have. And to do that, I think sometimes to step away from a conversation, to regulate, to become more able to discuss an issue that confronts my blocks in a more balanced way is helpful. I think normally it forces me to self-reflect a lot on what kind of value has been trodden on with that issue. What is it that I am objecting to? And then also lean into why it is that certain things have such currency and such resonance, you know. And I think that's important, especially when we're dealing with political divisions. Like, why is it that so many people vote for people that, from my perspective, do harm to them? What is it that they are speaking to? And I think there has to be something in the popularity of such figures that holds a certain element of truth, that holds a thread that we need to take up, whether that is about how the system isn't working in ways that maybe we're blind to, about inequalities that we haven't seen, about aspirations and hopes that have been disappointed, about grievances that our stories erase, maybe. And I think that's a really useful way for me of going, okay, and I think you can hold, I love this idea of kind of holding, I think it's Keats who spoke about that capacity to hold two competing ideas at the same time, and just being open about that helps me. And also trying to still, I was actually in America in 2018 when Trump was elected, and I was at a watch party with a load of Democrats and Republicans, and the basic rule as a Brit mainly was all of these people still have intrinsic dignity and humanity, irrespective of who they vote for. And I think that's what we sometimes lose, is the moment we get into dehumanizing or demonizing or disparaging and humiliating people for their views, we shut down any capacity and potential to actually engage with them as humans and to really understand what they've experienced. So I think for me, it's like still thinking about, right, if this was, you know, an aunt or an uncle, if this was someone that I loved, that I knew very well, how would I engage? And that kind of helps me.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, Claire. Thank you. And I think it definitely links back in my mind to what you were saying earlier around seeing the whole, you know, the whole person and the way in which identities become so singular. And we allow that to happen to ourselves as well. Let's be clear on that. But and it also sounds to me like what you're describing is kind of a shift from using cognitive empathy into then the felt empathy, which is to some extent also the kind of fake it till you make it, I suppose, practice. Okay, my last question is maybe not so is personal, but maybe in a hopefully nicer way, which is who, you can pick more than one, of course, if you want, who has inspired you with that empathy most? I know you've written about a few figures in your book, so maybe it might be one of them, but someone else also you might want to draw upon.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I think there's such powerful examples that other people can connect with. You know, people like Jacinda Ardern showed that it could be a part of the ethos. Barack Obama was speaking about it in 2006, this idea of the empathy deficit. I think he's been a really interesting figure and kind of leading that and showing the different ways of doing that. I find the work of people like Maya Angelou really useful for this, because I think she's someone who's come through real challenges and developed that kind of capacity for love and understanding with boundaries, with very clear boundaries. I mean, at a personal level, I think I grew up in a family where it was something that was just very important. You know, so I think looking at my grandparents, they were doing charity work well into their late 80s when they were helping at old people's home and were older than the old people in the home. You know, like, I think seeing my grandma organizing raffles for ladies and discovering these ladies who are 5 or 6 years younger than her, and like just that huge capacity to help others and be there for others and understand, I think was a real instructive kind of lesson for me. And I think we actually, the more we look, the more we see. I'm very much a pragmatic idealist, but I do think the way that you choose to look at the world will shape what you find. And I do think the more you choose to see it, the more you do, and the more you enable people to show it too. So yeah, I think there's a lot of people that have inspired me with that.
Oh, that's beautiful, Claire. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll end with one, and it might again be another like whoa question, but but I think in this kind of moment as we're wrapping up, I'm curious to know, like when you talk about like if you could kind of paint a picture, if you could tell the story of like the empathy catches wildfire
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes policy norm, just a norm of policy, a norm of how society works and function.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a vision or a story that you think that we could tell about, if we could go to that future or go to that moment? Could you paint a picture of that for it? And maybe it's not necessarily explicit about like a particular visual, and maybe it's more of a feeling. But when you think about the potential of empathy to change us, what kind of vision can we leave people who are listening with, or hope can we leave them with, the potential of empathy?
Oh wow. Yeah, it is totally you said it would be a whoa question. Yeah.
I kind of do. I was a little nervous, but we'll throw it out there.
That was my instinctive response. Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I think for anyone who's read the book, you probably see it like layered underneath. Like there is this kind of vision that I've probably kept a little smaller because it feels like a long way off. For me, I wonder if I can start the story kind of with the individual and then take it national.
Yes.
Individual, community, national. I think at an individual level, it's that we feel like we belong in a very deep, aligned way as part of a community and a people, that we feel celebrated for our individuality and our diversity, and that we are able to kind of tolerate difference and not see it as a threat, but see it as an opportunity for growth and for learning, that we feel able to be expansive. And for me, this idea of expansion is very key to empathy, because I do think it's an expansive verb. I think it encourages you to broaden your aperture, to broaden your horizons, to become more inclusive and accepting. But also that we start to feel more proactive, like more active agents within politics and society, that we're no longer as passive, that it's an energetic kind of, it motivates us. We feel energized, we feel more hopeful, we feel more engaged, but also we feel like we've got a stake in what is going on. And that we are both supported and nurtured and trusted in that, but that we are also able to give that in return. And then at a community level, I think it's about creating, again, vibrant, resilient, diverse communities where we are able to coexist with people from very diverse backgrounds in ways that we can learn from one another and take the best parts of all the different cultures and countries that we have to make something richer and stronger. And I think that quote from Joe Cox, who's a British politician who was sadly murdered a few years ago, about, we are all stronger united than we are apart. I've totally misquoted it, but that is that kind of, we are better when we work together and are united, and that in itself becomes innovative. And for me, empathy in a communal state starts to become more innovative, and people start to have more ideas, to use that imagination, to ask the difficult questions. I think it involves more spaces, more institutions, a society where we're leaning into the places where people connect and meet. I'd love to see more libraries, civic centers, sports centers, youth centers, more clubs, more societies. Like we derive belonging and meaning in them in ways that are not about our politics. I could go on longer, I think. And then at a national level, I think it's about, for me, empathy at a national level is about telling an honest story. And I think that's the problem, is when we only tell half a story, no one can really believe in it because it's not accurate. And we see this with a lot of countries. I live in Australia, where, Britain has had a real role in the Indigenous history here. And that's not a story we tell in Britain, and we should. It's a story they're grappling with here in Australia. But I think you become stronger when you can tell a more accurate story of who you are as a country, where it is hopeful and visionary, where it has that kind of inspiring element of we are growing something together. I think it's connected to ideas of equity and justice. And I think that empathy has to be matched with that. That kind of veil of ignorance is such a great way of thinking about how we engage in society. If you came back as anyone, and it speaks to that "how do you treat a stranger" quote that you so beautifully articulated. If you could come back as anyone, how would you design your society? And I think that would be the guiding principle of how do we design a society for the stranger as much as for ourselves. So it should be, I think we should see more equity, we should see more justice and a more proportional distribution of things and opportunities, and that accurate story about who we are. And I think as well, having institutions and political cultures and a media environment that supports that. I don't think it's just from the national level down. You've got to have those different elements that all speak to it. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we even got a little bit of the way there.
I agree. I'm rooting for this future for sure. Working towards it every day.
I mean, there's a huge sustainability piece about it we didn't even touch on. Like, I mean, the environment and empathy, and animals and empathy, and how we look after our ecosystems. Like, there's a whole piece where I think it should play a role too.
Oh my goodness, yes. So on the same page.
Yeah, amazing, Claire. Thank you so much for this. It was beautiful. And yeah, I mean, you're so right. There's hours more that we could go into, but maybe we'll reconvene again.
Oh, that'd be lovely. It's such a pleasure to speak with you both, and so many good thought-provoking questions.
Oh, well, thank you for taking us, going along with that journey with us. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.